Hi, welcome to session one of the third topic of the semester, in which we're now going to look at the Mexican background of Texas. And particularly, again, this topic is going to be dealing with Texas in the Mexican nation, 1821 to 1835, although we are going to look at the previous years before 1821, because we're going to actually examine here the process of independence. So it is in this topic that we're going to see independence from Spain. Texas was part of New Spain, this larger colony we have been talking about in the previous topic, looking at the Spanish colonization of Texas. And so it is in this topic that we're going to see the process of independence, and then, of course, looking at Texas living now inside of the Mexican nation. So let me share the outlines for this topic so you can see the title in the table of contents. This is just, again, very important. So we are now marking the beginning of a new topic. This is the third topic of the course, and that is now going to look at Texas in the Mexican nation. Again, the so-called Mexican background of Texas itself. So we have been looking, of course, in the first topic at the indigenous background. We did that extensively. In the second topic, we look at the Spanish background and the Spanish colonization of Texas. And we did that also very extensively because there's a certain heritage left by the Spanish in Texas, the kind of institutions they brought, etc. And of course, the heritage that came out of the interactions between the Spanish and indigenous peoples before. So the kind of cultures that emerged in Texas during the Spanish period are not necessarily 100% Spanish, even though there's very strong elements, again, of Iberian culture and society we discussed, but there's also, again, elements in which we see also elements that are mixed with the indigenous, again, beliefs and practices and elements, again, of those indigenous societies. So we looked at that again. For example, Indian Christianity or folk Catholicism is one, the mixing of the Spanish Catholicism and Indian ideas, religious ideas, again. So we were looking at that as well. And of course, mestizaje, the mestizos, of course, the mixing of Spanish and Native American, and the offspring, again, of the Spanish and the Native American will produce yet a new element, a new social group, again, mestizos. So there's also, again, that particular, again, idea. So now in this third topic, we're going to focus exclusively now on the text, on the Mexican background. Again, this is, again, the title, Texas in the Mexican nation. And the Mexican nation begins in 1821 and goes all the way to, in the context of Texas being part of the Mexican nation until 1835. Even by 1836, we're going to see the independence of Texas from Mexico, by the way. And that will be, again, a whole separate discussion, by the way. But it is in this particular discussion at this moment that we're just going to examine out the Mexican background. And again, the table of contents provide the main components, the main segments that we're going to cover in this topic. There will be three parts in this topic, and that is that we start with independence. Okay, so we start with this movement towards independence. More than likely, this is what we're going to be doing in this session almost entirely, because in the second session, we're going to now be looking at the ordeals of the new Mexican nation. And of course, Texas came into this new nation after independence, the nation of Mexico, the Mexican Republic, as one of the provinces or one of the states, of course. So we have to assess the political climate, the political scene of Mexico while Texas was part of this new republic, to look at the process of state formation or nation building. In other words, that there was really a series of challenges and trials, if you will, that the peoples of Mexico experienced as they tried to form an independent nation, to form a nation state. That is to say, that will suit the needs of the population all over the country, and there will be a struggle, of course, again. So we're going to actually examine some of those struggles. And again, this is going to be something very similar to the kind of struggles that other nations experience in terms of whether to create a nation that will be centralized, for example, that all authority will remain centered in a single figure, whether we call that figure a president, or we call, a Congress or a parliament in the capital city, or will there be some form of distribution of powers in which the state also will retain a certain sense of independence. And of course, Texas was one of those states that wanted to retain a sense of independence and not to remain centralized. So we're going to examine all of that in the second session. And then the last session, we're going to just examine Texas itself, Mexican Texas, as to what was really going on in the province itself. The kind of society, the kind of culture, some of the changes that are transpired between 1821 and 1836, how, again, Texas is going to be changing demographically, socially, culturally, what was the religion like, and so on and so forth. Again, just looking at Texas society and culture exclusively during this period of time. Okay, so let's start then with the independence of of New Spain from the mother country, Spain, that is to say. Okay, so okay. So let's start with part one, independence from Spain. Okay, so again, the process of independence. So we begin here then with the end of the colonial period and looking at the process by which the peoples of New Spain, and we're going to also look at Texas as well, began to move towards independence. And it is critical to assess this because, the factors are very complex. There's a number of different factors that were involved in convincing segments of the population that Spain, that New Spain, the colony in this case, the colony needed to move in a totally different direction and declare independence. So in order to really understand the process of independence from Spain, let me first provide an assessment of the historical background of the independence movement. In other words, the independence movement did not really begin to originate a few years or even a couple of decades before the independence was declared in 1810. Again, so 1810 is the beginning of the independence process. and it's going to conclude in 1821. Okay, about 10 or 11 years of worth of struggle. So in order to understand the background of the independence movement, we really need to go back in time and examine perhaps the century prior, okay, to 1810, because we see slowly but surely the conditions coming together for moving segments of colonial society into the Declaration of Independence, that is to say. Okay, so let's then begin with the historical background of the independence movement. And one of the leading factors that is going to create the conditions for independence is that the Spaniards back in Spain introduced a new social system in their colonies in America, in which they divided the colonists into different groups, which were categorized as races. In other words, the formation of races, if you will. Okay, and by dividing the population in this fashion, what they attempted to do was to gain a more firm, if you will, control of the colonies and to bring the colonies closer to the mother country as close as possible, of course. And that was the intent in this case. So we see again that this is going to be critical, because once people were divided into different races, of course, we're going to see that there's going to be struggle and competition between those races, and this is going to pave the road for some of those groups who felt excluded to go ahead and declare independence from Spain. Okay, because the Spanish introduced a very rigid social system in which access to resources, access to land, access to political power, access to higher office, whether in the church or elsewhere, was very limited, was very constricted, because those were limited to just a handful. Those who were reserved, in this case, those who were reserved for a handful of individuals who were born in Spain. So let me provide a more in-depth, again, analysis of how colonial society is going to be organized and structured, and this is going to serve, again, our understanding of how the independence movement is going to unfold later on. So again, to start with, it's at this juncture, it's very, very helpful to underline here something that is very critical, of course, for not only understanding, the formation of Spanish colonies, but some of the changes that were transpiring during this time in the world at large, in human history, and that is that with the discovery of America, okay, what we're going to see is that as the Spaniards and the Portuguese, and later on others, but particularly Spaniards and the Portuguese, are arriving to the New World, and they're encountering populations that were unknown to them. And there were so many different linguistic groups, ethnic groups living in the continent. And as they're moving inside of the continent and colonizing it, it was mind-boggling, again, to see just so many different groups, of course. Not that they were not accustomed to diversity, they were. We talked about that in the past. But some of the things that they were very, very boggled by is, the fact that there were just so many different ethnicities, if you will, ethnic groups, each with their own dialect or tongue or language and so on, and identities all scattered through the territory. Not only that, but they're also arriving to Africa, to the continent of Africa, and they're also encountering upon the peoples of Africa who also were subdivided into so many different ethnicities as well, and linguistic groups, linguistic backgrounds, and such. If we add to that, that again, over time, the Europeans are going to arrive to Asia, places like India and China and so on and so forth. So what we see again is that this age of encounters, the encounters of all the peoples and the cultures and civilizations of the world, uh, was a new phenomenon, a new development, you know, for the Europeans who were stepping out of the continent to navigate and establish colonial outposts or settlements, again, in different parts of the world. They're encountering with the cultures of the world and so on and so forth. So what this is going to to lead to, as we'll see, is that in order to make sense again of the different groups that they were encountering, they kind of oversimplified uh, the groups, the human groups that populated the globe, and began to divide them into what today call races, even though this concept of race didn't exist. Didn't exist until the Spaniards began to formulate it in the 1500s. Because when you look at world history prior to the 1500s, before the discovery of America and so on and so forth, we don't find, again, the concept of race being used anywhere around the world. Okay, so this idea that there were different races, for example, that populated the globe. I mean, this is something that is going to come out of this process of the discovery of America and the colonization of America, by the way. And this is a historical fact, by the way, that the concept of race came with the colonization of the New World, that is to say, with this process. But it's not just the colonization of America, but it's also the age of encounters that I just explained, the encounters of the different continents and the peoples that inhabit the globe that were very different from one another. Because when you look at how people differentiated themselves in the past, was not by looking at different races. Okay, they knew that there were differences between different human groups, but they identified those races as being part of different ethnic, religious, or cultural groups. Okay, for example, inside of Europe, we don't find, for example, Europeans referring themselves as the European race. Okay, because Spaniards consider themselves as to be distinct and different, let's say, from Germans, because they spoke different languages, they have different ethnic backgrounds, different histories, different religion, different culture, and the like. So if you were endorsing a different religion from, let's say, your own group, you were considered part of a different group. And that, again, those were the differences. You're a different culture, different ethnicity, different religion. Those were the markers, if you will, that separated people and identifying themselves with different groups. Not because, again, the idea of race was present and they said, okay, this is this race and this is another race and so on and so forth. Racial consciousness was not yet emerging in history anywhere, not until the encounters of all the populations, of course, of the globe. So the age of encounters, as I mentioned, led to the formation of racial categories. Because what the Spaniards are going to do is simply oversimplify all of those differences that I just mentioned, particularly physical differences, and pretty much lump them together as people that share the same, for example, physical characteristics, as to be part of one single race. Okay? Sorry. So Native Americans, of course, as we're going to see, again, constituted one race, the peoples of Africa another, and so on, again, the peoples of Asia, so on, again. Just kind of oversimplifying it, again. So this is something that is going to be implemented, those racial categories, if you will, in the American continent. This is not to say that the rest of the world is following the same path, the same pattern of thought in terms of trying to see human populations in this fashion, divided in different races, but rather that the Spanish and the Portuguese, as they arrive and establish colonies in America, they're going to divide colonial society. In other words, that because the colonies are going to espouse or conform peoples coming from different parts of the world, they're simply going to kind of divide them, if you will, into a specific racial category, and then position them inside of a kind of ranking system, again, in which each racial category occupied a specific place within the hierarchy, that is to say. Okay, so it's called the caste system. Okay, so this again is something that is emerging in the Spanish colonies, in that we can say the creation of castes or castes. Okay, different racial groups, if you will, that were categorized as such, because what we know from anthropology, of course, is that the concept of race, of course, is not really real. Okay, this is an artificial, if you will, construct. This is something that humans, created for the purpose of perhaps building a social structure, organizing society in a specific way for specific purposes, whether it's to organize it politically, organize it economically, and so on. So again, because the societies were very diverse and there were peoples from many different ethnic backgrounds that coming from different parts of the world, what the Spanish are going to do is pretty much organize them in this fashion, in that people who shared similar characteristics, even though they were not really connected in the same group, the same ethnic group or linguistic group, it doesn't matter, because ultimately they all share certain markers, physical characteristics that for them, they just kind of generalize. Again, it's okay, so this is one race, and this is another race, because they share certain common characteristics and so on and so forth. So because of that, we're going to see the rise of a caste system. And the caste system in America, again, was a system in which people were not only divided by racial categories or under racial specifications, but also organized economically, in that each one of those groups was going to perform a specific economic and also a political function in the society. Okay, so once again, this is very important, because as we'll see, as this system is going to be introduced, what the Spanish were actually doing is pretty much paving the road for the competition of those groups amongst themselves, and perhaps some of them are going to form alliances in order to much later move towards independence and declare independence from Spain. So ultimately, it ended up actually working against the original purpose, which was to tie the colony together with Spain, with the mother country, to tie it as closely as possible. So in the end, we're going to see that a lot of groups ended up, in the end, detaching from the mother country again. So what this caste system is going to do, I mean, it's something I describe very quick, in very general terms. Very quickly, I was describing this in the previous topic in Spanish colonial Texas. But here, I'm just going to kind of explain it in the context of how this is going to help the cause for independence. But in general, what this racial division of labor is going to do, in which different groups were divided along racial categorizations and so on, that were performing a different function in the society, is that uh, in the 1500s and in the 1600s, we're going to see that this caste system, as it was called, was a type of aristocratic social system, very similar to the one that existed in Spain and other parts of Europe, in which the social position of an individual was determined by birth. In other words, it was so rigid that people couldn't move out of that category in which they were born into. Okay, whatever the category you find yourself at the moment of birth, that is going to be your social position. That's going to be the station of life, and is going to be very rigid in that will be very hard to jump to the next one. Social mobility is not going to happen, at least for a few centuries in Spain. And so, as we'll see, this created a certain sense of anxiety, in the colonies, in that some people felt alienated or unable to move out of that system. And of course, this is going to lead to the independence movement again. So that's what an aristocratic society is. Whenever you find an aristocracy, is any society in which the members of the society inherit their social standing, their social status and position through their families, through their birth. So again, Spain just was exactly like that. And back in Europe, of course, there's a lot of societies that are still functioning under that system. All right, so the first group, and again, I'm going to be filtering this information in terms of the independence process. So the first group, the first racial category that was established in this caste system, as it was called, in New Spain and all the other Spanish colonies, were the Peninsulares. I mentioned that again in the previous topic at the end. So Peninsulares were considered to be distinct, different from Spaniards born in America. So what is a peninsular? Well, it's really an individual born in the Iberian Peninsula. That's why it's called Peninsulares. They were born in the Iberian Peninsula, meaning in Spain. But those individuals called Peninsulares were also born of noble lineages. In other words, their birth did not take place in in a family of farmers or ordinary merchants or artisans, for example. But rather that those were people that were born out of noble lineages, meaning those were born out of those feudal lords, the people that had become part of this feudal caste in Europe, the landowners, that is to say, that go back, many, many centuries into the past, who were the lord protectors of the realm again, and in many cases, many of them actually fought for their kings to regain Spain from the Moors and so on. Nobility. Okay. So if you're born in that station, in that particular situation, in that family, then with the colonization of America, what happens is that the Spanish king wanted to have the leaders of the colonies to be as loyal as possible to the mother country and to the king himself, okay, to the Spanish monarch. Once again, so the idea is we want to tie the colonies closer and closer together to the mother country. So we must then create a caste, a group of people that are born in Spain, they're born in Europe, they're Europeans, who will be the leaders of those colonies. And so in many cases, the Peninsulares that came to the New World were actually sent by the monarchy, by the Spanish king, as personal envoys, personal ambassadors, personal, appointments. Those were people that were very well known to the king, that were very loyal because they were part of the families that, again, surrounded the nobility and the noble families that surrounded the monarchy, and if you will, served the monarchy in Spain. So by sending them to the New World, they were to serve the king without any questions, without any thought of disobedience. They were to be 100% loyal, in other words, okay? Called Peninsulares. And the vast majority of them were given appointments to lead the large urban centers and the capital itself of the colonies. So in this case, we're talking about New Spain. So therefore, many of the Peninsulares lived in Mexico City, okay, a great many of them, and also in the large urban centers because they were either the governors of the provinces or the bishops of the church, the archbishops as well of the church. So they lived in the largest urban centers, including, of course, the capital. Again, the Peninsulares. Those were the elites, by the way, who held the highest political and religious appointments or office. The viceroys, the governors, and highest church administrators. Again, the Peninsulares. And again, they're going to pretty much remain as the elites, the religious and political elites, throughout the colonial period. And office, the highest office, of course, was reserved only to those individuals. So what this is going to do, as we'll see, is that this is going to breed, if you will, a certain sense of resentment from the other colonists that, the colonies, of course, no matter how wealthy you are, if you were not born in Spain, you just don't have access to those offices, of course. So again, this kind of paved the road for independence because over time, by the 1700s, we're going to see a growing number of people that were growing very discontent with the Peninsulares. And the Peninsulares are not going to be very much welcome, as we'll see in the provinces or in the colonies again overall, because they were seen as to be serving, again, the King of Spain, and not necessarily the provinces or the towns or the cities, that they all pay taxes to the Peninsulares, and they're not going to enjoy a lot of popularity, as we'll see. Of course, just below the Peninsulares, we're going to find yet another caste. This is something I explain, of course, at the end of the second topic, the Spanish colonization of Texas. Towards the end, again, I was talking about the criollos, the Creoles. And likewise, again, what we find here is the creation of another racial category. Now, somebody might be perhaps asking at this point, wait a minute, Creoles are Spaniards, and they're 100%. So how is it that they're different from the Peninsulares? And once again, the categorizations, the specifications of those races were arbitrary. In other words, they're artificial, in that those are not necessarily biologically real by any means. Because they're still, again, the criollos, even though they were considered to be a separate racial category, by the way, under the Spanish caste system, they occupied yet the second level below, which is the level below. The first tier or the first group is the Peninsulares on top, and then second place comes the criollos. They come below, and they're still Spaniards. They were born out of Spanish parents, again, 100%. But because they were born in America, they were considered to be belonging to a different racial group, which once again is quite, such an artificial category in this case. Perhaps because, the justification back then, at least on the surface, was, because If you were born in America, we're not really sure whether you come from noble lineages, from the aristocracy of Spain, etc. And many of them, of the criollos, actually came from aristocracy, by the way. Okay, many of the criollos, the Spaniards that were born in America, not all of them, but a great many of them actually came from noble lineages. But the fact that they were born in America put them below the Peninsulares, economically and politically, in the social and economic ladder, and even the political ladder. So why? Why is this? Well, because the Spanish crown and the advisors, again, of the king believed that people that were born in America were not going to feel that loyal to Spain. Okay, so these people are born elsewhere, and their loyalties, their upbringing, their emotional attachments, if you will, are with the region in which they're born. Again, so they're going to feel more connected, again, to their province. Whether we're talking about Texas, for example, okay, so people, criollos born in Texas, are going to feel more Texan than Spanish, in the sense that they perhaps have never been to Spain. They were born and raised in Texas, so they feel much, much connected to the province. That is to say, even though they're Spaniards, their parents were Spaniards, and they can even trace their origins back to Spanish nobility, but nonetheless, their attachment, their loyalty is with the town, the region in which they were born. So therefore, Spaniards born in America were considered to be criollos or creoles, which, by the way, in the Spanish caste system, a creole is different from the French caste system, because France also created a caste system based on different racial categorizations, in which the creoles were actually people born out of French and African parents, that is to say. Okay, so those are different. Again, specifications, and once again, is all artificial in the way they were constructed, by the way. So again, here in Spanish, in what's called this in Spanish America, the categorizations are different in that the creoles or criollos are simply Spaniards born in America, and that they're going to be allowed to create enterprises. So they do have access to economic resources. They don't have access to the highest political offices, of course, like the church, like the bishops and archbishops, or the highest political office like viceroys and governors. But nonetheless, because they're Spaniards, they do have access to economic resources. And in many cases, they were the ones that were involved in the creation of enterprises like haciendas and ranches, plantations, for example, trade, regional trade, for example. Many of the merchants were actually criollos, and a great many of them were involved also in mining operations as well, owning a little mine or running the mine, for example, extracting silver or gold, etc. And also, they were the members of the city councils, again, that govern each town. So every town was governed by a cabildo, I mentioned, which was a city council. And the members of the city council were local officials, many of whom were actually ranchers or hacendados and so on and so forth. And they were creating policy for the town. So all of the towns were in charge. The criollos were in charge of those towns. All of the towns across New Spain, including Texas, again, were governed by the criollos. Okay, even the lower clergy. When we talk about the lower clergy, we're talking about, again, the priests that presided over mass and so on and so forth. There were criollos as well. So this is significant because the criollos are going to play a critical role in leading the movement towards independence, the leaders of independence, they're all criollos. They're all going to be criollos, okay? The leaders, that is to say, the people mobilizing and the forces, rallying the masses for independence, declaring independence, and so on. Again, all of them, without exception, were criollos. And of course, they resented, by the 1700s, they came to resent, of course, the fact that the criollos being so prominent within their own provinces, within their own towns, and so on. They were running the most important enterprises and so on. They ultimately lacked access to political office, the higher political office, not just local office, but again, for example, they couldn't influence policy at the provincial level, meaning the governors that were governing those provinces, again, enacting taxes or the kind of taxes that the colony was going to pay to the king of Spain and so on. They just didn't have any say, no representation, that is to say. So there is going to be growing resentment, as we'll see, by the criollos or the creoles. And by 1810, we're going to see that the soil was already ready for the independence revolution to explode and begin. And of course, this is something that was brewing for several centuries, actually, as the criollos were, the class or castes known as the criollos were created, and all the Spaniards born in America were confined to that position. And was very, very hard to climb the social ladder unless you pretty much marry into the Peninsulares. Again, perhaps that will be one way that if you marry, again, a Peninsular might get your family to climb the ladder, but otherwise you're pretty much, stuck there. All right. So now we also talked about another racial category. Okay. Another racial category that the Spaniards introduced to their colonies to actually organize the Native American population and position all of the Native Americans in that particular category so they can play a function in the colony. And that is, again, the function of paying tribute, if you will, okay, to the Peninsulares, particularly to the Peninsulares, but also to pay tribute to the criollos as well. So those are the Native American groups, and they call them Indios or Indians, by the way. This is a term that today many Native Americans do not agree that is consistent with how Native Americans actually describe themselves or see themselves, because the term Indio, of course, came from the idea of Columbus that he had stumbled upon India in 1492 when he arrived to the New World, and when he saw the natives, he called them Indians, meaning that he believed he was in India, in the subcontinent, in Asia, that is to say. And so because he was confused, or was where he actually was, he called the natives of America Indians. But in reality, again, this is not how the Native American population describe themselves, or more importantly, the Native American population did not even describe themselves as members of one race, because they were distinct and different, let's say, from Europeans or from the peoples of Africa and others. There was no such a thing, again, anywhere in the Americas, that the peoples that inhabited the Americas saw themselves as one people, okay? And they were divided in a way that they identify themselves with a specific kin group, so kinship, okay? So kinship was the basis of their social organization and also social identity. What kind of, again, the family that you belong to, the lineage. In other words, like, this is my kin group. I belong to this particular family or clan, if you will. which is a cluster of families that we share common ancestors, if you will. Okay, and we're all kind of related by marriage, by birth, by adoption, and so on and so forth. It's kinship. And we share the same language, the same ancestors, and so on and so forth. And they saw themselves different from other kin groups, from other clans that also had different ancestors and languages, and so on and so forth. So there was never really a common identity among the Native Americans in which they saw themselves as simply natives. But rather, again, they were all divided in terms of clans, if you will. Okay, kinship, which is again the proper way of actually describing their identity. So when the Spaniards arrived, what they're going to do is that because Native Americans shared certain traits that were more akin to each other, that let's say the traits that Spaniards or Africans actually presented. So they're all going to pretty much be categorized simply as Indians, in other words. Okay. A new racial category is born. And again, those are just simply called Native Americans. But in this case, they were called Indios. In this case, Indios, that is to say. And they compose the largest segment of the population, again, of the Spanish colonies, by the way, the largest, particularly after 1650, when the Native American population is beginning to recover from the epidemics again that raged many communities in the past. They're beginning to recover. There was a boom, a population boom, actually, after 1650. They're going to comprise the bulk of colonial society. That is to say, the largest segment of the population were actually what the Spaniards referred as Indios or Indians in this case. Okay, so their position in the economic and political ladder was to pay tribute to the church and to the state, and also to provide tribute to the hacendados, again, to the landowners in this case, that were producing the products for the colonies. All the items of basic necessity, the indigenous population had to pay that tribute in the form of labor. Again, so they had to work in mines, they had to work in the haciendas. There was a rotation system, certain people worked in certain days, others in other days, and so on and so forth. But they had to pay tribute, once again, to those economic enterprises, but they also had to pay tribute, again, to the church and the state. The church also collected tribute from the Native Americans in terms of products, the grains, for example, or animals they produced needed to be paid to the church and also to the state as well. The state also collected also taxes in the form of products and the form of labor from the Native American population. Again, so that was considered a separate caste that was also below of the criollos, by the way. Okay, so very important because, as we'll see, during the independence process, okay, the leaders were the criollos. That's a fact. Okay, the leaders were all criollos, Spaniards born in America who lacked access to highest political office. But the people that were rallied, the people that attended the call of the criollos to go and fight, were actually the Indios, or the Indians in this case. Okay, the vast majority of the people that went out to fight during the process of independence were actually Indian groups coming from different communities, and they supported the criollos because they also wanted to free themselves, you will, from the Spaniards as well. Again, because of the tribute they paid, by the way, in terms of the work and the products to the church and so on. So they also wanted to free themselves as well from that type of system, if you will. So there's going to be an alliance between the criollos and the Indios, of course, in the process of independence. Okay, so I was talking about yet a separate caste, and that is the African slaves. Again, this is a separate caste that also uh, was created in the Americas. Although, as I mentioned a moment ago, the slaves that are introduced into the Americas are coming from many different regions of Africa. Okay, particularly the West Coast, the West Central Coast, but the vast majority, again, that come from America come from the West Central Coast of Africa. But they're coming from many different communities. They're coming from different kingdoms or from many different villages or ethnic groups that are very diverse linguistically, culturally, and so on and so forth. But when they enter again into the Americas, there's going to be also a categorization, if you will, that place them also as a separate caste, into a separate caste that was distinct, different from the indigenous and the criollos and peninsulares, by the way. From 1521 to 1600s, the ones that were coming in into the Spanish colonies were coming in to provide valuable service in terms of creating certain artworks, for example. Many of them brought certain skills like ranching and farming, for example, and they were doing that agricultural work. They were breeding cattle, for example, and they were doing domestic labor, again, for the hacendados, the landed elite, again, taking care of the household, gardening, doing some cooking, taking care of the household and so on, children, but also bread making. Many of them were very skilled in that, weaving textiles, again, and there's again during those times. What we're going to see is that the first wave of African slaves that are coming in are performing this kind of function for the Spanish, and by 1600s there's going to be the effort to convert them to Catholicism as well. Okay, so there's also the process of acculturation, in which during this time there was the effort also to transform the African slaves into Spanish as much as possible, in terms of teaching them the language, the manners, the customs, reading, writing, the religion, converting them into Christians and so on and so forth. Again, so there is that. After the 1600s, we're going to see the rise of sugar and tobacco plantations, for example, in Southeast Mexico and also in the Caribbean islands. And many of them are going to be doing plantation work, growing, again, cash crops like sugar and tobacco. And so what we see is that, yes, there is the introduction of this caste, but there's an acculturation process underway. They're converted to Catholicism, they're acculturated, and after 1600s, the vast majority of the African slaves that come into the Spanish colonies, they're coming into this Caribbean colonies like Cuba, for example, Dominican Republic, for example. Again, those colonies are going to be the ones receiving the vast majority of the African slaves. And so the Caribbean islands, again, that were controlled by Spain during this time, they're going to receive the largest influx of African slaves into those regions. Not so much in Mexico. In Mexico, there will be presence, of course, of African slaves, particularly in the southeastern part of Mexico. But as we mentioned, most of them became part of colonial society and were acculturated. Now, what is significant is, again, and this is critical, is that during the 1600s, for 2 centuries at least, the castes were prohibited from marrying into each other. Okay, so what that meant is that in order to hold a legal certificate of marriage that will be recognized by the colonial authorities, by the colonial legal systems, you needed to actually present your documents of ancestry. It's called pureza de sangre, purity of blood. What that meant is, well, if you wanted to marry, well, before you marry, you needed to prove that both of the parties come from the same caste. Okay, whether two criollos are coming from the same caste, or Peninsulares about to marry another Peninsular, well, guess what? They both need to actually demonstrate that they're both coming from noble lineages, that they're pure of blood regarding their ancestry, etc. So this became a common practice in order to prohibit, of course, people from marrying outside of their caste, that is to say. So only those marriages that are married within their caste and their have proved documentation, those are going to be legal. Not that other people were not actually, of course, creating families outside of their caste. They were significantly, but again, those were not legally recognized, okay, during this process. However, as we move into the 1700s, there's going to be significant change taking place, change that is going to be moving the colonies further and further away from the mother country, despite the fact that the mother country, the Spanish crown, was trying to do exactly just the opposite. But again, what is happening is that there's dramatic social transformations in New Spain taking place in the century between 1700 and 1810. Again, in that 110 year period, 1810, of course, is the starting point of independence. And that is because the colonies are experiencing a demographic growth. Okay, it's a population expansion in the colonies, which will lead to the rise of new castes, in other words. So let's say 1650, the population of New Spain was 1.5 million people, 1.5 million inhabitants in 1650. But as we move into, let's say, the 1700s, let's say by 1740, for example, onwards, the population already reached 2.5 million. And by 1790, there were already 5 million, again, inhabitants in New Spain. So the provinces are growing, the towns are growing everywhere, of course, not only in Mexico City, but all across, of course, the provinces. And by 1810, we've seen already 6 million people living in New Spain. Okay, so there's going to be the rise of new castes, new social categorizations, if you will, with the creation of new castes, and they're going to be mixed because, as I mentioned, there's going to be a lot of mixing going on, even though they were not legally recognized. Not the less, the fact is that there's plenty, of course, of mixing taking place, particularly between the criollos and the indigenous population. Okay, particularly between those, but that was not really constricted only between the indigenous and the criollos, but also the African slaves as well, and even African slaves with the indigenous population. So what we see is the rise of new categories like mestizo. The mestizos are peoples born out of Spanish and indigenous parents, okay? And they're going to rise dramatically. This is new because when the Spaniards first established this caste system, mestizos were just a handful of individuals, a handful literally. But by the 1700s, there's a growing presence of mestizos. You cannot ignore this group anymore because they're becoming very, very numerous all across the colony. Again, people that come from Spanish and indigenous backgrounds. That is to say, the mulattoes are people that come from Spanish and African slaves from African background and Spanish background. Okay, mulattoes. And the Sambos were people that were coming from indigenous backgrounds and African backgrounds. So we got new castes. Okay, at least three, one of which was the largest, and that is the mestizo, by the way. The mestizo caste was the largest again, and they became the second largest group of New Spain after the Native American Indians, again, or the Indios, as they were called. So I mentioned that the Indios were the largest. They constituted the bulk of the population. But by 1793, what we see is that the mestizos are second to the Indios in terms of population, in terms of numbers. Again, so they're growing again, and they're also going to play a critical role in independence because many of them also lack, of course, even access to resources like the resources that the criollos, of course, had access to wealth, for trade, for owning as hacienda, and so on and so forth. And the mestizos are going to actually compete and try to also come into the scene and also try to participate in the growing economy, because the economy is going to be growing significantly during this time for reasons I'm about to explain here. And that is that in the 1700s, as a result of this demographic expansion, this demographic growth that led to the new caste, we're going to see the ascendancy of the criollos in New Spain. Again, this is why they're going to become the leaders of independence, and why they're moving upward in prestige, particularly in prestige and economic affluence, is precisely because the population is growing. So because there's more people that demand basic products, people that demand food, beef, that demand clothing and other products, there was the need to produce them. So who is going to produce everything that the colonies needed, of course? So again, this led to the criollos now becoming far more involved, in commerce. They are going to grow in their commercial activities. They're the merchants trading goods from one town, from one region to another. They're the entrepreneurs. They're the hacendados, again, that have those landed estates, the haciendas, conducting things like ranching, for example, there, textile manufacturing, farming, etc. And they're investing, of course. What they're interested in is building more haciendas, building more ranches, and they're trying to invest in the purchasing of land and using that land for those commercial purposes, that is to say. So again, this is really going to change all the structure that I just mentioned that was very rigid, because this group of people, the criollos, are going to start growing not only in numbers, but their economic activities are expanding. And they're going to become a very powerful, of course, social force, economically at least, not politically. But this is the problem, that they had economic power, but not political power. And of course, this is going to create the conditions for leading the independence movement. Okay, so there's a growing domestic market economy. The population growth led to demand for consumer products like food, textiles, and commodities, which led the criollos to expand more haciendas, ranchos or cattle ranches, local businesses, and of course, many of them become independent producers, again, of the type of products, whether leather products, again, chocolate, dyes, there's a wide variety of different products that the colonies needed. Of course, they're moving into this market economy. So there's now the creation of a market economy, and that is fostering the growth, the economic growth of the entrepreneurial caste. The criollos are the entrepreneurs par excellence, and they're rising to prominence in Texas itself. It is the cattle ranchers. Okay, cattle ranchers are the ones in this ascendancy. In other words, this is the kind of economic enterprise that had been established, of course, ever since the 1600s, in the late 1600s. We see, of course, the beginning of, in the introduction of cattle in Texas. But as Texas is developing in the 1700s, the province, of course, we're going to see the formation of many independent cattle ranchers, of course, that own their own land. And because there's cattle markets in places like Saltillo, for example, in southern Mexico, and also in Louisiana, in French Louisiana before 1803. But after 1803, those cattle ranchers are now tying Texas to the U.S. economy through those cattle markets. Cattle ranchers in Texas rise to prominence. They are the entrepreneurial class, if you will, who as we'll see, will become very much affected by the politics of Spain, as Spain is seeing this productivity taking place and is trying to tax it in many cases. Okay, he's going to try to tax it, and in many cases, he's going to seize properties for those that did not want to pay those taxes. He's trying to tax the sales, the export of cattle, for example, in Texas, and they're going after the criollos, that is to say. So, as we'll see, the cattle ranchers in Texas were part of this criollo caste that is ascending because of the cattle ranching enterprise, but they're also going to be targeted again in terms of taxation very heavily, and this is going to push people again to join the cause of independence, of course. So the significance of this is that the domestic economy was becoming far more productive, far more profitable, more important than the external economy of exporting products to Spain. It became more profitable to consume products that people were buying in the colonies than, let's say, producing something that you had to ship to Spain. There's not a lot of money because you're producing something for the monarchy, and the monarchy is going to pretty much, again, be the one that is going to commercialize with it. And you were, again, just the producer, if you will. So once again, this type of change led to the rise of a capitalist economy and society in New Spain, something that we see already in Texas taking place with cattle ranching, by the way, the rise of a capitalist economy and society. So this is going to change those aristocratic, rigid social structures we mentioned, the caste system, because we're going to see the rise of a middle class. Okay, we see that in Texas as well. There's merchants, there's people engaging in trade, interregional trade, cattle ranchers, and so on, as well as in the rest of New Spain. We see, of course, the rise also of a middle class as well. Particularly, those are the new castes, the mestizos, for example. Okay, many of them live in urban areas, in the population centers, if you will, across New Spain. And they're also trying to go into the market by manufacturing products they can sell on the market, master artisans, again, that kind of tradition of having an artisan who has a shop at home and produces products for the market, shoes, hats, leather products, clothing, artwork in general, and teaches that to other disciples, whether family members, etc. Retail merchants, you want to open, again, a small store in which you sell the products produced by other local producers, artisans. Again, we're going to see that as well. Shopkeepers have a small shop or grocery store where people buy, again, local foodstuffs and so on. Rancheros, of course, in Texas, they're the most important one. Cattle ranchers, mid-level officials, and lower priests. Many of them are coming now, not necessarily from the criollo caste. This new middle class, as we called it, is really coming from the mixed race groups. The rise of this middle class. Okay, they're independent. They have a small business, a shop at home, they craft products and so on and so forth. Maybe a small rancher. This is not the kind of large ranches, again, that exist in central Mexico. So we see the formation of the small ranch. Again, this is the rising middle class. And again, the idea back then is that, those middle class status individuals that are coming from the other caste, like the mestizos, for example, mulattoes, particularly mestizos, they resort to what is called the family strategy for economic progress. That is to say that the entire family is seen as an important member of the enterprise. Everybody is performing some kind of work within the shop, within the store, within the ranch, and they all pretty much are like the investors and workers and owners at the same time. They work as families, that is to say, to sustain a middle class status. They all work together, that is to say. Okay. And the same holds true all over New Spain, of course, including Texas. We see, of course, those kinds of patterns as well in places like San Antonio. So the rise of wage labor, again, we talk about that, of course, because in the past, there was a reduction of the Indian population because of epidemics. What we see is that there was the need then to substitute the labor that the Native Americans produced, the tribute they rendered to the hacendados and to the ranchers and to the state and the church, to substitute that labor, that tribute, for wage labor. Okay, so labor shortages, if you add that there was a shortage of labor in order to manufacture everything that needs to be done, if you add to that there's a growing demand for consumer products, so therefore a new system was introduced, and that is wage labor. In other words, a new system of labor in which you hire somebody, you pay them a wage in order to carry out a certain function, whether it's to help you in the store, if you own a small store, etc., or cattle ranchers that needed to employ people to make it work. They're also going to start now hiring people again in those ranches, but thereby introducing, of course, the system of wage labor, which is part and parcel of a capitalist economy in a capitalist society, that how people organize to get things done in a capitalist economy and society is through the payment of wages. This is how we organize ourselves. So one last component here is, again, of the kind of changes that are transpiring from the rise of this capitalist economy and society, is that with the introduction, if you will, of capitalism, the rise of a middle class, the criollos are on the rise. They're becoming the major entrepreneurs, investors, if you will, expanding the haciendas and so on. The introduction of wage labor, what we see is that the New Spain as a whole was now transitioning in the late 1700s from a caste system in which people were categorized based on castes, caste that you're born into. If you're born into, let's say, Native American, you are just Native American. That's your position. Or if you're Criollo, or if you are mestizo and so on, that instead, what we see with the rise of capitalism is that society was becoming more and more class-based, that instead of dividing people along race and different racial categories or castes, that instead we're moving now towards a class-based society in which distinctions between individuals and groups are based on class. What social class do you belong to? Not necessarily the race. And that's still important, but as we're moving into a market economy and people can now rise the economic ladder, you can actually acquire a different status for yourself and a different social identity that is not going to be identified by race, but rather by your economic standing, that is to say. Okay, so class-based society, classes, social classes, again, whether it's lower class, middle class, and upper class. So this is now becoming more important, if you will, by the late 1700s all over New Spain, including, of course, Texas, by the way. So population growth added to this market economy and the creation, of course, of new enterprises and wage labor and so on, gave rise to the emergence of social classes, some of which were identified, for example, as journeymen, what is called simply just working class. Again, they were simply called journeymen, people working for a daily pay, sometimes performing menial jobs in occupations. You get you move up the ladder and you start looking at other people that are from a higher class, in which they're going to be called administrators, managers, merchants, and at the very top, of course, the entrepreneurs. Okay, the upper class, if you will. So there's different classes that do not pretty much obey a racial categorization anymore, but rather people are moving more and more towards a more capitalist system, if you will, in which society is being subdivided in terms of classes. That is to say, so your social position by the end of the 1700s, and this is critical for how Texas is going to shape, again, is entering the age of capitalism, if you will. Texas, as a result of the changes that are transpiring in New Spain, in what is called Mexico, by the way. So this is the influence of this experience in the late colonial period, again, in which Mexico was part of, that we're going to see that as Mexico was transitioning, what is called New Spain back then, was transitioning into capitalism, that Texas was also transitioning into capitalism, not only because of the influence of Mexico City or the whole colony at the end of the colonial period, but also the proximity with the United States, by the way, in the trade that existed. So by the end of the 1700s, as we move into the 1800s, already the society, colonial society, was one in which the social position of individuals were more and more determined by class and occupation, and race became a secondary classification. They're still there. It's still important, but now, since this is the era of the market and the market economy and commerce, and people are trying to produce for the market and ascend economically because of the activities that are the most productive. So therefore, what we see is now that people are beginning to identify themselves as members of their class, whether it is middle class or upper class. And there's an aspiration to climb the ladder. There's the aspiration to ascend the economic ladder and trying to move upward, called social mobility, move upward in the ladder and trying to earn a better standing in society. It got to the point again that by 1795, just about 15 years before the independence was declared from Spain, it got to a point that anybody in New Spain that wanted to claim higher status racially speaking. Okay, so you want to claim that you have more Spanish blood, okay, that, let's say, other types of blood, that you come from noble lineages, or that you come from Spanish background, that you can actually buy an act, a certificate that will actually say that, okay? And this was legal, okay, because the king actually passed a law, the king of Spain, that was called the Real Cédula de Gracias al Sacar, okay, 1795, in which what this did was that any individual that wanted to buy a certificate of origin and ancestry indicating that they belong to Spanish families, noble families, so they just wanted to earn that reputation, you had to pay for it, okay? In other words, you can buy your way into a higher caste, because this is a new system in which if you have economic power, you can actually buy a new racial label, a higher one, in other words. So they will give you a certificate, okay? Because that's what's important now. It's not that important that you demonstrate, you bring your family tree and so on, and trying to, stamp it and certify that you indeed come from a noble lineage, but you can actually buy it. In other words, you can, because it's more a class-based society. So with your affluence, with your wealth, you can buy yourself again into a higher caste through the Real Cédula de Gracias al Sacar in 1795. So what this cédula did, in very simplistic terms, is simply indicate that the times were changing. The society of Spain is changing, is that becoming more oriented towards capital as the source of wealth, not necessarily race as the source of wealth. That if you are productive, if you're an entrepreneur, if you are a hard worker, have some form of business going, that's what matters. this is going to determine who you are in society. That is to say, of course, this is, of course, influencing the development of Texas, because Texas is already moving towards this capitalist, if you will, kind of system, in which we're going to see is going to play a key role, of course, not only in the independence movement from Spain, but also down the line, Texas independence from Mexico as well. Again, this idea of private property, entrepreneurs, and so on is going to be well established in Texas. That by the 1830s, we're going to see a revolution, the Texas Revolution, again, in which capitalist formations, capitalist ideas centered on the idea of private property is going to play a key role in organizing Texas in this movement towards independence. Okay, so at any rate, that's all I have for you. It's already 1:20. So in session 2, we're going to actually just cover the remaining portions of the independence from Spain. Then let's just look at Mexico. Again, the Mexican politics, the formation of the Mexican state, and how Texas was caught in the middle, in the crossfire, again, of Mexican political struggles, which is going to be very helpful for understanding, of course, much later, how Texas is going to decide finally, again, to detach also from Mexico. Okay, so that's all I have for you, and we'll see you then in session 2 of this topic. Goodbye.